from Trump's point of view, I do think that, presenting himself as being anti-war has helped him politically. It helped him in 2016. I think it also helped him in this campaign. And here he is again, turning his back on the people who supported him, in part at least, because they thought he would, end the wars as he promised to do in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And so I don't think the people of Gaza as a whole signed up to sacrifice their lives and their homes and their futures for October 7th. That's where it gets tricky with resistance.
My pointed question to you is, do you think that the coalition that Assad led and Russia and Iran supported do you think they are better than the rebel forces supported by the West?
And that's why, unfortunately, places like Democracy Now!, where I learned so much about journalism, invaluable show, a noble show. It really is. I love Democracy Now! I worked there for 10 years. It taught me so much, and it's such an important institution, but even they have blind spots.
Hello and welcome to another episode of India and Global Left. If you're new to our show, smash that subscribe button. You can donate in the link given in the description below. Be a YouTube member by hitting the join button, or be a Patreon by following the Patreon link. That helps us sustain ourselves. But the easiest thing you can do is to watch our shows, hit like, share, and comment. Without further ado, let me welcome our guest today, Aaron Maté. Aaron Maté is a Canadian writer and journalist. He hosts the show Pushback with Aaron Maté on the Grayzone and also the Useful Idiots podcast. Aaron has previously worked as reporter and producer for Democracy Now! And Al Jazeera, among others. Aaron, welcome to India and Global Left.
Good to be here.
I want to discuss the Middle East, Ukraine, Russia, and a little bit on media, Western media in particular, both corporate and alternate media. But given the situation in Palestine, let's start with Palestine itself. We have been covering Palestine with various guests and sometimes focusing on latest updates. If we can take a step back with you and ask, how would you define what happened on October 7th and what has happened since then in the last 13 months?
October 7th was an act of resistance against one of the longest running military occupations in the world. Hamas's aims, I think by now, are pretty clear. They wanted to capture Israelis to exchange them for captured Palestinians. There are thousands of Palestinians held in Israeli prisons. And they also wanted to inflict a military blow on Israel to show that there's a cost to keeping Gaza under siege and keeping the West Bank under Israeli occupation and siege as well, where settlements are constantly expanding and the settlers are harassing the indigenous Palestinians of that land. In the process, I think Hamas lost control of what was happening, and you had people, crossing out of the Gaza concentration camp. And in the process, atrocities were committed against civilians, and civilians were kidnapped. I'm not sure if civilian kidnapping was a part of Hamas's plan, but that's what happened. And Israel responded predictably by going after its traditional targets, which are Palestinian civilians. And Israel has basically used October 7th as an excuse to fulfill a longstanding aim of destroying Gaza, because Gaza is sort of the center, the heart of Palestinian resistance, always has been. And so, personally, I think you can question the strategic wisdom of Hamas's operation and whether they properly factored in all the necessary elements that would go into deciding whether or not this was a prudent thing to do, including whether or not they had their allies on their side, like Hezbollah and Iran, which I don't think they did. I don't think Hezbollah and Iran knew anything about October 7th beforehand, despite Israeli propaganda to the contrary. Because now Gaza is destroyed. That is the result of October 7th. And but that is a question for Palestinians to decide. It's not us who are outside of Gaza who are living under military occupation. And so people living under military occupation have the right to decide how they choose to resist that occupation. Um, but we have to acknowledge that that act of October 7th, it's resulted in Israel taking advantage of what happened and making Gaza unlivable. Gaza will never be the same again.
And to follow up on your point that whether it was a prudent decision is for people of Gaza to decide and not for us. The Grayzone interviewed the spokesperson of Hamas. If I recall his name, Dr. Hamdard. He spoke about October 7 as sacrifice. Can you tell us a little bit about what do you think about Hamas being a representative organization, or to what extent you think covering Gaza that Hamas represents the will of the people?
Well, I'm not in Gaza right now, so that's hard for me to say. And it would be wrong for me to try to, try to summarize what the will of the people in Gaza is. I can tell you anecdotally that none of my friends in Gaza liked Hamas, and none of my friends agreed with, or how do I put this? None of them thought that October 7th was worth it based on the price that they paid. And, you know, this is where it gets tricky with resistance. Hamas had every right to resist a military occupation and to launch an operation targeting the Israeli military infrastructure that is used to occupy Gaza and keep it under siege, which is what they did on October 7th. But when that results in civilians being killed and civilians being kidnapped, then you're essentially giving Israel the pretext that it has always wanted to destroy Gaza. Whether Israel doesn't have the right to do that, obviously, Israel doesn't have the right to fire a single bullet into Gaza, but that's been the practical result. Israel was going to take advantage of violence and was also going to fabricate claims of atrocities, as they did with the dozens of beheaded babies and the mass rapes. And so you have a conflict here. There is the right to resist, but there's also the right for people for in Gaza to live. And I don't think the people of Gaza as a whole signed up to sacrifice their lives and their homes and their futures for October 7th. That's where it gets tricky with resistance. So, I don't think we can say either way how the people of Gaza feel. I can tell you anecdotally how my friends in Gaza feel, and they don't feel as if it was worth it because their lives have been destroyed and they've lost dozens of family members. So it's a tricky thing. I guess from the outside, it's not my place to judge either way because I'm not the one living under military occupation. And also, we have to acknowledge this that uh, Hamas and the Palestinians have been pushed into a corner where Israel has rejected every possible peaceful resolution to this conflict. Leaders of Hamas have come out and accepted the international consensus of a two-state solution, which for Palestinians is a massive compromise. It's in fact a surrender because Palestinians would be accepting there just 22% of their historic homeland, 22% of what Israel stole from them. And even members of Hamas, including Ismail Haniyeh, had basically accepted that. Rather than engage with those overtures from Hamas and the Arab League, which has offered Israel for a long time peace in exchange for a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, Israel has carried out, continued massacres in Gaza, continued land theft in the occupied West Bank, continued sieges of Gaza. And when Palestinians in Gaza protested peacefully in March 2018 with the Great March of Return, which is what Palestinians have been told to do for so many years by Western liberals, Israel gunned them down with American-made weapons, and everybody stood back in the West and yawned. So that call for the so-called Palestinian Gandhi was exposed yet again to just be a complete joke and completely hypocritical. So in that context, when you have Israel rejecting every possible peaceful resolution to this issue, and when you have Israel ramping up its aggression, I mean, before October 7th, it was one of the deadliest years for Palestinians in many years, including for Palestinian children killed by Israeli soldiers and settlers in the occupied territories. In that context, I fully understand the rationale of saying that, well, military resistance is our only is our only hope. Um, and I don't question the right to carry out military resistance, but even people who have the right to resist military occupation still have to think of the consequences of a particular action. And I don't judge Hamas for carrying that out, but I just have to I have to say that um, it's it's a fair question, certainly for Palestinians to decide whether or not it's served or held back their goal for liberation. Because are we any closer now to a Palestinian homeland, to Palestinian self determination than we were before October 7th? Yes, there is more global awakening now. In fact, it's unprecedented the level of global uh, awareness of this issue, at least in my lifetime. But has the cause for Palestinian self-determination actually advanced? I don't know about that, actually. And in fact, I think you could argue that October 7th has set it back. These are tough questions. And I want to be clear that my place as a Westerner is not to issue judgments, but I do think these questions are fair to raise.
I remember doing a podcast with Norman Finkelstein prior to what happened in October 7, and he was very, very pessimistic about the fact that the Palestine question has fizzled out of the international discussion. Um, from that extent, it has definitely changed because a lot of people now know a lot more about um, the settler colonial project and the genocidal project of Israel in Palestine. I want to keep Middle East as a background, but I want to bring the recently concluded US election into our discussion. One of the things you wrote recently that Trump sees political benefit in leaving behind the neocons who dominated his first term. And I I was imagining you had probably Ukraine in mind. I want to ask you, but I was also a little bit puzzled given your sharp focus in Palestine. Um, what made you to write that statement?
Yeah, well, listen, yeah. So you're referring to something I wrote on Twitter, X, and what I said is that Trump might see political benefit. I didn't say he does see political. I think he said he might see political benefit in leaving behind the neocons. And the reason why I wrote that is because he went out of his way to say that Mike Pompeo and Nikki Haley uh, will not be joining his administration. But obviously, even in writing that he might see political benefit leaving behind the neocons, I was being too optimistic. And what that looks like that was in Trump saying, um, oh no, you're right. Actually, you know what? Let me correct myself. I'm looking at the tweet. I did not say might. You're right. I did say that. I said, okay, here's what I wrote. I said Trump going out of his way to announce that Pompeo and Haley won't be joining his administration suggests he sees political benefit in leaving behind the neocons who dominated his first term. But then I said, hope this is a trend and not a one-off. So the question there is, was this just like a one-off stunt to tell people, I'm not going to have these neocons in my administration, but then bring them in anyway? Or was this a trend? And it turns out this was not a trend. This was a one-off, and this looks like this was just a stunt to make it look as if he was renouncing neocons by, precluding two of them, Pompeo and Haley. But then since then, we've learned that he's picked neocons for his new cabinet. He's picked Elise Stefanik to be the ambassador to the UN, who is a diehard anti-Palestinian. She basically led a congressional witch hunt against the campus protests for Palestine against genocide that we've seen in the U.S. over the last year. And as we're recording this, it's rumored that he has picked Marco Rubio, the senator from Florida, to be Secretary of State, and also a diehard neocon. So my initial tweet, even though it was
Also,
qualified,
Mike
sorry,
Waltz as also there are reports by I guess it's by the Wall Street Journal that he would probably choose Mike Waltz as the NSA, the National Security Advisor, who is also an extreme hawkish on Iran and definitely
yes,
China. We discussed separately China. Yeah.
yes, and formerly worked for Dick Cheney. And this is after Trump campaigned and tried to appeal to Arab Americans and Muslim Americans by pointing out that Kamala Harris had been campaigning with Liz Cheney And now Trump is rumored to have picked Mike Waltz, who formerly worked for Dick Cheney, as his national security advisor. But, as we're recording this, and things will change by the time you release this, but as we're recording this, only Elise Stefanik has been confirmed as an actual Trump pick. So Marco Rubio and Mike Waltz, as we're recording this, have not been confirmed as the picks yet. But regardless, it does look like I was wrong to believe that Trump is sees political benefit in leaving behind neocons, because he's not doing that at all. And of course, it makes sense he wouldn't do that, because who gave money to his campaign? It's people like Miriam Adelson, a hardcore Israel supporter who spent more than $100 million to get Trump elected. And that's who Trump answered to in his first term. And all indications so far are that that's who he's answering to in his going into his second term. And it's too bad for many reasons, foremost to the world. But even for, like from Trump's point of view, I do think that presenting himself as being anti-war has helped him politically. It helped him in 2016. I think it also helped him in this campaign. And here he is again turning his back on the people who supported him, in part at least, because they thought he would, end the wars as he promised to do in Ukraine and in the Middle East. And so this would be yet another betrayal of some of his supporters, just as it was in 2016 when he promised to be a champion of the worker, and then turned around and appointed a cabinet full of billionaires. So, I wrote sort of an ill-advised tweet, basically, that even though I qualified it, I didn't say Trump is leaving behind the neocons, because I said that this could just be a one-off. Even that was even a little too optimistic, and so I apologize for that.
Yeah, I was a little bit surprised given, to my mind, his policy, at least in Palestine, is very clear. And that, I think, brings us to discuss Ukraine and Russia, where I think it's much more muddled, it's much more confusing. Even people like Marco Rubio, who might become his Secretary of State, is very clearly hawkish on Palestine, is much more mixed and confused about Ukraine and Russia. Initially, he supported NATO's war in Ukraine against Russia, but later on he moved against the $95 billion aid package for Ukraine, Taiwan, and Israel, citing the bill's lack border security provisions. Can you tell us, because there are actually right now at least two views on Trump administration on Russia and Ukraine. Some say that, oh, Trump is too inconsequential, and it's actually the military industrial complex, it's the neocon lobby within the deep state, and also in Europe, that would determine what happens in Ukraine. But there is another view which says that Trump sees the prudency of prioritizing Russia because his main enemy is China, as he believes, and so he might normalize with Russia. Which view do you lean towards?
Trump has shown that when he speaks off the cuff, that he can display an understanding of world events. 2016, his presidential campaign was largely just him freestyling, and he recognized, because I think he's tapped into the trends of the electorate, that neocons and the wars that they oversee were unpopular, and so he criticized them. And he also talked about how it would be good to get along with Russia, and he talked about the need to try to avoid nuclear war. That helped land him Russiagate, which was a scam, concocted by the Hillary Clinton campaign and then picked up by the intelligence community to frame him as a Russian agent and to basically blame Russia for his election, to claim that Russia had hacked emails and put out social media memes that brainwashed and manipulated millions of Americans into not voting for Hillary Clinton. And because the national security establishment embraced Russiagate, that helped box Trump in and incentivize him to show that he could be a tough guy with Russia and be a hawk. And certainly all the neocons he appointed encouraged him to do so as well. So despite talking about the need to get along with Russia, Trump, as a president, policy-wise, was a complete hawk. He sent weapons to Ukraine that Obama wouldn't send because Obama was worried about escalation. He tore up really important arms control treaties with Russia, especially the INF Treaty, which had eliminated an entire class of dangerous weapons, and basically helped set off a new arms race between the U.S. and Russia. That's what Trump's move did. Um, he tried to kill the Nord Stream 2 pipeline between Russia and the rest of Europe. And he tried to overthrow one of Russia's top allies, Venezuela. I mean, those were his actual policies. And they were made more dangerous by the fact that rather than talking about those policies, Democrats were busy pretending that he was a Russian agent and that Robert Mueller was going to prove it. So now Trump could have stood up to all this and said, yes, I'm being framed as a Russian agent, and this is, you know, but I'm not going to cave to this neocon pressure, and I'm still going to pursue my call for diplomacy with Russia. And he did complain about it sometimes, about how all this was poisoning relations with Russia, but he didn't do anything about it. Policy wise, he went with the neocons pretty much every single time. So what that showed was that Trump has no actual, he may have some instincts, but in terms of actual principles, being willing to, expend political capital on his beliefs, he's not willing to do that. And he just wants to be liked by the forces in Washington. And he doesn't want to do anything that will, seriously disrupt the priorities of the national security state. So I suspect now it's the same thing with Ukraine. The war is a disaster. And Trump claims it would have happened under his watch. But I'm not sure about that actually, because Trump's policies, including arming Ukraine and tearing up arms control treaties, helped contribute to the factors that went into Russia's invasion back in February 2022. And so, Trump now, he recognizes that the war is a disaster, that the U.S. is spending a lot of money, but yet he helped pass the legislation that got Joe Biden his latest $61 billion proxy war lifeline earlier this year. Trump basically gave his blessing to Mike Johnson to let that pass. So it's not, you can't even say that Trump has been a consistent opponent of Ukraine funding. At this point now, the Ukraine war is winding down because Ukraine's running out of people to sacrifice, and Russia continues to take more territory. But whether Trump will go out of his way to make a peace deal with Russia that recognizes Russian security concerns, that tries to roll back the U.S. military, the U.S.-led NATO military infrastructure that surrounds Russia, I seriously doubt that. I think what Trump will do is probably try to freeze the conflict for a long time, maybe agree to not have Ukraine join NATO, but Ukraine's not joining NATO for a while anyway, because this promise of future membership to NATO to Ukraine has just been used as an excuse to integrate Ukraine into NATO militarily without actually giving it the membership that would require NATO to defend Ukraine if it went to war with Russia. So the open door to Ukraine in NATO is basically a backdoor through which NATO can fight Russia. It served its purpose now. The goal in Ukraine has been to weaken Russia, to bleed Russia, maybe lead to Vladimir Putin's overthrow if Russians suffer enough. Russia's certainly been bled, but it's not been weakened to the point where Putin is in trouble. So it served its purpose. So I think Trump will probably pursue some sort of long-term freeze without really addressing the core Russian grievances that helped start this whole thing, including the expansion of NATO in Europe, with the exception possibly of maybe they'll take NATO for Ukraine off the table for an indefinite period of time.
NATO also brings us to Europe. There is a lot going on about rethinking NATO even in Europe. And while there are some number of European countries who have been endorsing Palestinian cause selectively, at least um, Ireland, Spain, Slovenia, and so on, and condemned Israel's specific actions. On the question of Russia, Europe has been extremely and almost unanimously very, very hawkish. President Macron and Boris Johnson recently doubled down in continuing the war with Russia. And Brussels has been now rethinking about diverting what is called as the cohesion fund in the EU, which is essentially a fund earmarked for developmental purposes, to divert it into military, anticipating the continued escalation with Russia on one hand, and Trump's insistent that this should pay more for the NATO. This is over and above constant push from Poland and other East European countries to increase the military budget in the EU. What do you think is EU headed towards in this triangular pressure?
Sorry,
Um,
what is he headed towards
I,
in what?
my question is there are two views essentially being discussed about Europe. One view says that a Europe which should pay for its own defense would probably be more independent of the US, and that might be better for a multipolar world. And there is another view that says that, oh, it might probably increase and escalate overall Western military spending, essentially escalating the difference between the global North and the global South. What do you think about it?
Well, the trend has been to escalate military spending, and I don't see that changing. Trump certainly loves to brag about how he got NATO to spend more on its military to meet that 2% of GDP threshold, and I expect him to continue that. Um, Europe has, I think, really weakened itself by being so reliant on the US. I mean, like, look at Germany prior to the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines. Germany was getting a sizable amount of gas from Russia, and cutting that off has led to soaring energy prices. Where now, Europe is still getting Russian gas, but now because they don't want to buy it directly because of the proxy war in Ukraine and the need to look tough on Russia, they're buying it at a markup via other countries. So other countries get Russian gas, and then it goes to Europe through them. So economically, it's suicidal. And Europe has always been known, like, or many countries in Europe have always been known for having, generally strong social welfare programs, which have been undermined by the Ukraine proxy war, by spending all this money on the military. So as to why people like Olaf Scholz have gone along with this, have committed economic suicide to for the goal for the US led goal of bleeding Russia and Ukraine, I don't know, but certainly I don't think it's good for their long term health. And as a result, we're only going to see the rise of right wing forces in Europe, because that's who takes advantage of times of deprivation, is right wing groups, as we see with Trump too. They demonize the wrong people. They blame immigrants. They blame the marginalized, rather than looking at how much money they're wasting on these military conflicts. And that's what Europe, unfortunately, I think, has done by following the U.S. line on Ukraine.
I wanted to ask you about Syria. You have been tweeting about Israel bombing Syria recently, and there is a lot in the internet. Um, I would see them as allegations and at times even propaganda about your support uh, of the Assad government and the coalition during the civil war. My pointed question to you is: do you think that the coalition that Assad led and Russia and Iran supported uh, do you think they are better than the rebel forces supported by the West? Or do you think that you were just talking about sanctions imposed on Syria by Western government that is obviously unacceptable under international law?
Look, first of all, you mentioned there's allegations on the internet that I support the Syrian government. If you look at the substance of those allegations, there's nothing to go on. It's not for me to support or not support governments that I have nothing to do with. I've never lived in Syria. I'm not Syrian. It's for me to weigh in on my own government's actions. In the case of Syria, that meant waging one of the most covert, sorry, that meant waging one of the most expensive covert dirty wars in U.S. history. The CIA spent billions of dollars. We don't even know how much because it's secret, arming an insurgency that it knew was dominated by Al Qaeda and later ISIS. And I don't think it's our business to do that. I don't support dirty wars. I didn't support the Iraq War or the intervention in Libya, and on and on and on. And but for some reason, when you oppose that same policy in Syria, you get accused and dismissed of being a supporter of the government. Um, I know people have suffered on the Syrian government domestically. They are a police state. Dissent has not been allowed there. My point has always been it's not our business, and certainly it's not our business to try to overthrow a government with violence, with one of the most well-armed insurgencies in history. And then when that failed to impose, well, or in conjunction with that, to impose murderous sanctions that target innocent civilians inside Syria. So that's always been my position. And the reason why I get name called is simply because I got involved in this issue by simply reporting on leaked documents from the OPCW, which is the world's top chemical weapons watchdog. And what these leaks showed was that an allegation made by the Trump administration that Syria used chemical weapons in Duma in April 2018, that allegation was baseless, and that the actual OPCW inspectors who went to Syria to investigate this alleged chemical weapons attack found convincing evidence that this incident was staged by rebels on the ground, which then triggered a U.S. military strike by Trump's administration. So that's what I've done. And for doing that, I get called all kinds of names. But if you want to see how substantive these, like this name calling and these allegations are, try to find one article refuting anything I actually say, or that shows, even that demonstrates any claim made about me that tries to paint me in an unfavorable light, like that shows the evidence that I somehow am a supporter of the Syrian government. It's all that is just done to try to silence the reporting I've done on a really important issue, and that still hasn't gotten much attention because there was such a huge propaganda effort to manufacture consent for the Syria dirty war. And that's where those chemical weapons allegations come in. And this goes back to every single regime change campaign to justify, militarism for bombing a country and for, putting it under harsh sanctions. You have to paint the government in question as so barbaric, so demonic that you can't possibly negotiate with it, and that all of its and that basically the entire country represents some unique evil that has to be destroyed. So in the case of Iraq, it was WMDs, and it was collaborating with Al Qaeda, and it was rape rooms, it was ripping babies out of incubators. Those are the atrocity propaganda claims used to justify all the attacks on Iraq. In Libya, it was that Gaddafi was going to commit a genocide in Benghazi and was handing out Viagra to his troops to commit mass rape. And as we saw with October 7th, it was that Gaza committed mass rape and beheaded dozens of babies. And in Syria, it's the same thing. It's that Syria, despite all the evidence, despite leaked documents from the OPCW, despite leaks from the US government itself, which there have been many of, that Syria somehow decided that even though it knew that using chemical weapons would trigger US military intervention, and even though using chemical weapons would paint it in such a negative light in the eyes of the entire world, that someone decided to go ahead and use chemical weapons. And by the way, what's interesting is the insurgency in Syria has taken territory, over the course of the war in Syria, the insurgency took territory many times. For example, it captured an entire province in Idlib, which it still rules. Idlib is ruled by a rebranded version of Al Qaeda. And somehow, whenever the Syrian government is accused of using chemical weapons, it's never in these moments when the insurgents are taking entire provinces and swaths of territory. It's only against innocent civilians, in their homes, who pose no military threat at all to Syrian government forces. So it's just completely nonsensical. It's undermined by all the available evidence. And that's why, rather than trying to refute me or refute the leaked documents that show the cover up of the OPCW investigation in Duma, you get name calling. And in the case of the OPCW leaks, you get memory holding. So if you try to read Western media accounts of the issue of chemical weapons in Syria, you'll see one through line. They never, ever, ever mention the OPCW leaks and the whistleblowers that challenge the cover up of their investigation. They don't exist. So just to give one illustration, there's a Washington Post reporter named Joby Warwick, wrote an entire book. It's called Red Line. It's about Syria and chemical weapons. Okay. It's a whole book. It came out in 2020. Okay. So Duma, the story I reported on, was in April 2018. Joby Warwick ends his book at Duma, where he says the Syrian government was accused of carrying out a chemical attack. And later on, the OPCW confirmed that Syria was guilty of using a chlorine attack. He doesn't mention that leaks came out from the OPCW that undermined the OPCW's public claim. They simply don't exist. And in all the so-called reporting on the topic in the Washington Post, he never even acknowledges the existence of the leaks and the whistleblowers. Under what circumstances would you decline to even mention that these leaks and whistleblowers exist? It's when you know that if you do acknowledge their existence, then you have to try to refute them. And because you can't refute them, you simply have to make them disappear. So that's how Orwellian and propagandistic our media is when it comes to the issue of Syria. And that's why people like me who dissent from that line get smeared and dismissed as Assad apologists and all that.
You mentioned about Idlib. It fell to the rebel forces, whom you call insurgents, in 2013, or maybe Raqqa fell in 2013 and Idlib in 2015. And then Russia intervened along with Iran, and the balance of power shifted since 2015. And by 2018, except perhaps parts of Idlib, most areas came back to the Assad government. Do you think that was a positive step?
Do I think it was a positive step that Syria was not ruled by Al Qaeda and their allies?
Not
Yes,
not
I do.
not Al Qaeda and its allies, because the West, a lot of the rebel forces and the West were also fighting Al Qaeda, but they were supporting these groups against the Assad government. So, um, eh, yeah.
No, they weren't fighting. Like uh, the U.S. armed an insurgency that it knew was dominated by Al Qaeda. There's in fact there's a book by Ben Rhodes, who was a former top aide to Barack Obama, where he talks about the contradiction in U.S. policy in that they had the Al Qaeda franchise in Syria on a terrorism list, but then he says that this was contradictory because Al Qaeda was a part of the insurgency that we were trying to help. so, so yes, they did have Al Qaeda on a terrorism list, but they were assisting and arming an insurgency that they knew was dominated by Al Qaeda. So, for example, when Idlib was seized by Al Qaeda, the U.S. provided operational support to the insurgents that were retaking Idlib, knowing that Al Qaeda was an integral part of that operation. So it's true that when the U.S. came in, they did start bombing ISIS, but ISIS at that point is separate from Al Qaeda. And do I think it's positive that Al Qaeda and its allies didn't take over Syria? Yeah, I do. I do. I mean, if you listen to John Kerry, there's a leaked recording from John Kerry where he's talking to some Syrian opposition activists. He said the reason Russia came in was because ISIS was threatening to take Damascus, and we were watching. And he explains that we were watching because we were hoping that the threat of ISIS taking Damascus would put pressure on Assad and force him into negotiating his way out of power. So Kerry was admitting that the U.S. was tacitly using ISIS as leverage to force regime change in Syria. And I don't agree with, again, the U.S. has no right to try to change someone else's government. That's the fundamental, whatever you think about the Syrian government, the U.S. doesn't have the right to overthrow it. People have criticisms of the U.S. government. I don't think Syria or Russia have the right to overthrow the U.S. government. So assuming we're not Western chauvinists and we see everybody is equal and have every state is having equal rights, what right does any government have to overthrow another? Especially if the people you're trying to put in power, as John Kerry admitted, risk being ISIS or Al Qaeda. So, yeah, it's not even a question of like a moral judgment of who's better than who. It's a question of international rights, and I just don't think governments have the right to overthrow other states that they don't like. In the case of Syria, the reason why they're trying to overthrow the government, as is laid out in documents from State Department emails. Hillary Clinton was sent emails talking about this. The reason and Ehud Barak, the former Israeli prime minister, talked about this, that overthrowing Syria would be great to weaken the axis of resistance to Israeli hegemony, because Syria was a key ally of Iran and Hezbollah. Hezbollah moves weapons through Syria, for example. So I just don't agree. Like anytime you have the U.S. and Israel trying to overthrow a government to help expand their hegemony, personally, yeah, I think it's a positive thing if they fail. That's my personal view. But even aside from a moral judgment, they don't, what's more important is they don't have the right to do that. Regime change is not legal under international law. And I think if we cared about a safe world, we try adhering to international law rather than subverting it.
I just wanted to, I asked this because in Syria in 2011, it was part of the uprising, which a lot of people, and I think you would agree with them, that they characterize them as insurgencies. And obviously, you've reframed my question as the Al Qaeda and the West versus Assad and Russia, and then it becomes a much easier question to answer. But I was not entirely sure if the so-called interim government, which was a coalition of course, Al Qaeda, the West, but also it included many other groups that were characterized and labeled as nationalists and sometimes Democrats and so on. And that was my question. I think the difficult question is about.
I don't know what you're talking. Honestly, I don't think we have the same view of the origins of the Syria war. Look, I have friends in Syria who went out and protested the Syrian government because they were protesting authoritarianism, corruption, repression, abuses in prison. That's what they were protesting. But the moment Syria became a sectarian war, which was apparent from the start, see, you know, any sort of movement against the government is not going to be, you know, homogenous. There's going to be diversion. So yes, you did have people protesting corruption and authoritarianism, and fair enough. I mean, they have every right to do that. But you also had a sectarian component from the start. You had chants of, for example, Christians to Beirut, Alawites to the grave. You did have attacks on police and the army from the start. This idea that the Syrian war began as a mass, peaceful, nonviolent, peaceful movement is just not true. I mean, I wasn't there at the time, but I think by now we can establish from the reporting on the ground, the investigations that have been done, the things that have come out, that there was violence from the start, that there were attacks on Syrian forces, along with the brutality and torture of the government. I mean, like these things are messy, but and there were weapons coming in at a very, very early stage. They were being facilitated in part by the U.S. through Benghazi and Libya. That's why the U.S. ambassador to Libya, Christopher Stevens, he was killed in Benghazi at a U.S. facility that was being used to ferry weapons to Syria from Libya. After the U.S. overthrew the government in Libya, weapons looted from the Libyan government were being ferried off to Syria from Libya. And that's what the U.S. ambassador was facilitating, Christopher Stevens, when he was killed. There's an article about this by Seema Hirsch called The Red Line and the Rat Line, which I recommend people read. So from the start, I think you could argue that, yes, there were people out on the streets motivated by for noble reasons against authoritarianism and corruption and torture. Fair enough. But there also was from the start a violent sectarian component. And it's that component that the U.S. and its allies supported from a very early stage. When exactly they got involved, I think we'll only know the answer to that question and when things are declassified in many years. But if you look at history, there's plenty of examples where we learn, 50 years later, 60 years later, that the U.S. played a cynical and dangerous role earlier than thought. I mean, look at what we're still learning about the coup in 1953 in Iran, backed by the CIA. We're still learning about the U.S. role in that. And I would bet we'll learn similar things about the U.S. role in Syria as we will about the U.S. role in Ukraine, where there was a coup in 2014. And I think the U.S. was more involved than has been publicly disclosed.
I wanted to quickly ask you about the non-corporate media, of which I see you as a part of in the US, and the Democratic Party divided the non-corporate progressive left media in the US. The key question was whether the Democratic Party is a larger evil or not. And now that the elections are over and the Trump is back to power, what are your thoughts about the strategy of left and progressive forces and also the alternative media in the US to go about from here?
I thought this election posed a really difficult choice, and I didn't claim to know the answer to that choice. You have the need to impose a cost on Democrats for facilitating a year-long genocide, and the refusal by some people to vote them back into office after doing that, versus the very real possibility that Trump and his gang could be even worse. Which, for a while I subscribed to the view that there's nothing worse than genocide, but actually it could get worse for all we know, because Trump could be even more bellicose in backing Israeli aggression than Biden was. I know it's hard to imagine, but it's possible, because Israel could, be even more aggressive in the occupied West Bank. It could attack Iran's nuclear and energy facilities. So anything is possible. And plus, there's the fact that I just think everybody, I don't think among leftists this is controversial. Domestically, Democrats are better than Republicans. Republicans serve the ultra rich entirely. Democrats also serve the ultra rich, but because they also have in their coalition unions and more people of color, they do historically uh, advance programs that are a bit more democratic and a bit more equitable at home. And look at Biden. I mean, you can point to, he didn't do very much, but he did have he did lower the cost of prescription drugs. He did put some good people on the National Labor Relations Board, and things like that do make a difference. I do subscribe to the Chomsky view that even the smallest differences between the most powerful make a world of difference for the most marginalized. I do think that's true. And I was never trying to tell anyone you should vote for Democrats to keep Trump out of power at a time of genocide, because how can you tell someone that, especially if you have family who's been through the genocide or is now being bombed and displaced in Lebanon, to vote for the party that is doing that to you? But my line was that it was a tough choice, and you have two competing imperatives here. Now that the election is over, personally, do I feel some satisfaction seeing that the people who facilitated a genocide lost, and that the genocide is at least being talked about as a factor in their defeat in Michigan, especially? I do. That's my emotional reaction. But politically, we do have to think clear-eyed about the Trump administration now, because that's who's coming in and who will be staffing it. And so far, it looks like Trump is appointing the same neocons that surrounded him in his first term, and the same ultra wealthy that will continue to transfer, wealth in this country to the upper class. And there's also the question of abortion, which is, for women foremost, is a really pivotal issue. And Trump does have reactionary policies on that. And also undocumented immigrants. He's promised to ramp up cruelty towards them. So these are things to be clear-eyed about. And the election is over now. And so now, like, whatever people thought about what was the most prudent strategy in the election, defeat Trump or punish Democrats, it's over now. And now, the job of journalists should be to focus on those in power, and coming in, that's going to be Trump. And so people need to be, despite people's, for those who are feeling satisfaction that Democrats lost, that's now over. Now the focus has to be on the dangers that Trump and his administration pose.
My last follow-up on this, I promise. A lot of US left and progressive media, at least to our reading, is extremely hostile to China, um, Venezuela, Cuba, Syria, Iran, and so on. And you have been reporting on a lot of them, and you have been also part of the US media. Can you talk about why does a lot of otherwise progressive US left media, why are they so hostile to these countries?
Look, we live in a really sophisticated propaganda system in the US. And it's a propaganda system where no one's telling you what to say. But, certain issues just become so toxic that if you dissent from the party line, you'll face costs. You'll be canceled. You'll be called names. You'll be marginalized. You won't get invited to, parties and gatherings that you used to get invited to. And that creates and you won't be given jobs and bylines and promotions. And so that creates a subconscious incentive, whether people realize it or not, to toe the party line. And so you have throughout, recent history, so many examples where just people, no one was told what to say or what to think, but people just intuited that if they took certain positions, if they followed certain paths, they'd be marginalized. So take, for example, Russiagate. Looking back at it now, no one defends Russiagate now. This idea that Donald Trump engaged in a sprawling conspiracy with Vladimir Putin and that Putin manipulated Americans into voting for Trump via hacked emails and memes. Nobody takes that seriously now, except for people, in the hardcore Democratic Party mainstream. But if you looked at left media back then, that was a time when Trump had just won. People were understandably afraid of Trump, and people were scared about doing anything that possibly could be painted as being sympathetic to Trump or pro-Trump. When actually, in reality, I mean, just putting aside the fact that journalists should be concerned about facts, not which side they're on. Uh, Politically, Russiagate, I always argued from the start, was a big gift to Trump, because what could be a bigger gift to Trump than having his opposition focused on a dumb conspiracy theory, the dumbest conspiracy theory of all time. But people weren't willing to see that because just the media consensus was so overwhelmingly all in on Russiagate. And it created this incentive structure that if you're in lefty media and you want to get accepted into, polite society, you want to get invited on CNN, or you want to get invited to parties or bylines or job, or you want to be considered for future jobs, you're going to buy into Russiagate. And for myself at the time, that was a time when I was still trying to establish myself as a journalist. I'd recently left Democracy Now, where I started out. I'd been there for 10 years. I remember thinking to myself, like, I knew Russiagate was bullshit from the start, but I remember thinking I had to consider whether or not I was going to come out against it, because I knew it would set me on a path that I couldn't come back from. That, like, once you take a stance on such like a toxic issue where you're going to be in such a marginalized position, you can't come back from that. And for me, I was like, fuck it. This thing is so dumb and so dangerous for so many reasons that it was worth it for me to speak out against it. But that's how I think you have consent manufactured is people. I don't think they think consciously, I'm going to be a dupe, I'm going to repeat propaganda, but they internalize the consequences of speaking out. Take also the issue of mass rape on October 7th. Now no one takes that seriously anymore. Everyone recognizes that that was a scam. But back when it was, again, becoming a thing, you could count on like one hand the people that were pushing back against it. It was, us at the Grayzone, Electronic Intifada, Mondo Weiss, and collectives of Middle Eastern women who were calling this out as basically as racist propaganda, which is what it was. It was based on this stereotype of Arab men as savages, because there's no evidence to go on. So therefore, you had to appeal to people's biases, and that's what it was. But look elsewhere for any other examples of people joining us. No, because people weren't ready, didn't have the fortitude to go there yet. So that's how manufacturing consent is established. And same thing with Syria. I mean, look at all the name calling that I get for taking the stance that I have, even though what I've just done is journalism on leaked documents, which is what journalism is supposed to be about. People see the name calling and the marginalization, and people, in the case of Syria especially, were duped by a lot of propaganda. Same with Ukraine as well, the Ukraine proxy war. So, and that's why, unfortunately, places like Democracy Now, where I learned so much about journalism, invaluable show, a noble show. It really is. I love Democracy Now. I worked there for 10 years. It taught me so much, and it's such an important institution. But even they have blind spots, and it speaks to not corruption or people selling out, but just how sophisticated our propaganda system is, and how even noble, enlightened people can be duped into buying into propaganda that they generally challenge. And so that's just an unfortunate reality of living in the most sophisticated propaganda system in the world. It creates subconscious incentives for towing the party line.
Aaron Maté, you were more than generous than the time we had decided earlier, and you answered our questions very patiently. Thank you so much for joining India and Global Lab.
Good to be. Thanks for having me.
Hi, my name is Ayushman. I, along with Jyotisman, have started this platform. In the last 2 years, we have tried to build content for the left and progressive forces. We have interviewed economists, historians, political commentators, and activists so far. If you have liked our content so far and want us to build an archive for the left, I have two requests for you. Please do consider donating for the cause. Link is in the description below. Also, if you are not able to do so, don't feel sad. You can always like our videos and share our videos to your comrades. Finally, don't forget to hit the subscribe button.